The ancient text of Revelation, written nearly 2,000 years ago on the island of Patmos, has captivated readers with its vivid imagery of beasts, dragons, and catastrophic events that would unfold at the end of days. For centuries, scholars, theologians, and everyday believers have attempted to decode its symbolic language, searching for clues about future events hidden within its cryptic passages. Among the most persistent interpretations are those that connect Revelation's prophecies to Adolf Hitler and the Second World War, arguing that the apocalyptic visions John recorded match the horrors of the Nazi regime with unsettling precision. This interpretation suggests that Hitler, the man responsible for the deaths of millions and the near destruction of European civilization, fits the profile of the Antichrist figure described in biblical prophecy. The claim is bold and controversial, yet those who study the connections between ancient prophecy and modern history find patterns that are difficult to dismiss entirely. To understand how anyone could make such a connection, we must first examine what the book of Revelation actually says about this figure of ultimate evil. The text does not use the term Antichrist directly in most passages. That term appears more prominently in the letters of John, but Revelation describes several malevolent figures, including the beast, the false prophet, and various manifestations of evil that Christian tradition has long associated with the concept of the Antichrist. The characteristics attributed to this figure are scattered throughout Revelation and other biblical texts, creating a composite portrait of someone who would rise to power in the last days, deceive nations, persecute believers, and wage war against God's people before ultimately being defeated. Traditional interpretations have identified 10 key characteristics or descriptions that this figure would embody, drawn from various passages in Revelation, Daniel, and other prophetic books. The first description concerns the nature of the Antichrist's rise to power. Revelation chapter 13 describes a beast rising from the sea, given authority by the dragon, which Christian interpretation identifies as Satan. This beast receives power and a throne and great authority. The passage emphasizes that this authority is given to him, not seized entirely through his own might, suggesting a figure who rises through a combination of supernatural enablement and political maneuvering. Hitler's rise to power bears examination in this light. After the First World War, Germany lay in ruins, economically devastated by the Treaty of Versailles, politically fragmented, and psychologically traumatized. The Weimar Republic struggled to maintain order amid competing extremist factions. Hitler, a failed artist and decorated war veteran, joined the German Workers' Party in 1919, which soon became the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. His oratorical skills and ability to tap into German resentment propelled him into leadership, but his path to ultimate power was neither straightforward nor solely of his own making. The Nazi Party remained relatively minor until the Great Depression struck in 1929, crushing the German economy and creating mass unemployment. This crisis provided the conditions Hitler needed. However, even at the height of Nazi electoral success in 1932, Hitler did not win an outright majority. He became chancellor in January 1933 through backroom political dealing, appointed by President Hindenburg after a series of failed coalition governments. Conservative politicians believed they could control Hitler, use him for their purposes, and then discard him. This proved to be a fatal miscalculation. The description in Revelation of authority being given rather than entirely self-seized resonates with how Hitler's power was conferred by others who thought they were manipulating him, not realizing they were facilitating the rise of something far more dangerous. Within months of his appointment, Hitler had maneuvered to consolidate absolute power, but the initial granting of authority came from those who underestimated him. The second characteristic found in Revelation chapter 13, verse 3, describes a head that appeared to have a fatal wound that had been healed, causing the whole world to be astonished and follow the beast. This cryptic passage has been interpreted in numerous ways throughout history, but applying it to Hitler and Germany requires looking at Germany's condition after the First World War. The German Empire had been decisively defeated, its military dismantled, its economy destroyed by reparations, its territory reduced, and its people humiliated. The nation that had been a great power lay broken, seemingly mortally wounded on the stage of world affairs. Yet within 15 years, Germany had not only recovered, but had become the most powerful military force in Europe under Hitler's leadership. The speed and extent of this recovery astonished the world, just as the prophecy suggests. Germany's resurrection under Nazi rule seemed almost miraculous to contemporaries. The economy recovered, unemployment vanished, infrastructure projects transformed the nation, and the military, which had been limited to a mere 100,000 men, grew into a formidable war machine. This transformation was achieved through a combination of economic policies, including massive rearmament that violated the Treaty of Versailles, and the cultivation of a national mythology that Germany was reclaiming its rightful place. The world watched in a mixture of horror and fascination as this wounded nation not only healed, but arose more dangerous than before. Whether this constitutes the fulfillment of prophecy or simply a historical parallel depends on one's interpretive framework, but the pattern match between Germany's recovery and the description of the beast's healed wound has not escaped notice by those seeking prophetic connections. The third description involves blasphemy and claims of divinity or supreme authority. Revelation 13, verse 5, states that the beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise authority. The concept of blasphemy in biblical context involves claiming attributes or authority that belong to God alone, setting oneself up as divine or as the ultimate authority above all moral law. Hitler's ideology and the cult that surrounded him bear examination here. The Nazi regime promoted what can only be described as a state religion, with Hitler positioned not quite as a god in the classical sense, but as a messianic figure whose will was law and whose vision was absolute truth. The famous slogan Ein Volk, Ein Reich, Ein Führer, meaning one people, one empire, one leader, elevated Hitler to a position beyond mere political authority. Nazi propaganda systematically cultivated an image of Hitler as Germany's savior, the man chosen by destiny to restore German greatness. Children were taught to revere him, prayers were modified to include references to him, and his book Mein Kampf was treated with a reverence typically reserved for sacred texts. This went beyond normal political personality cult. Hitler's ideology explicitly rejected traditional Christian morality, replacing it with a racial ideology that made the Aryan race the highest value, and Hitler the supreme interpreter of what this meant. He claimed the right to determine who deserved to live and who should die, who was human and who was subhuman, usurping moral authority that religious tradition attributes to God alone. His speeches often invoked providence and destiny, positioning himself as the instrument of historical forces greater than individual human will, yet simultaneously claiming that his will was the embodiment of these forces. This simultaneous claim to be destiny's servant and its master, to be implementing cosmic law while being its definer, fits the pattern of the blasphemous claims the prophecy describes. The fourth characteristic concerns making war against the saints and conquering them. Revelation 13 verse 7 explicitly states that the beast was given power to make war against the saints and to conquer them, and was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. The term saints in biblical language refers to God's people, believers, those set apart for holy purposes. Hitler's systematic persecution of Christians who opposed him, alongside the more well-known Holocaust against the Jewish people, demonstrates a pattern of warfare against religious communities. While Hitler maintained a complex relationship with Christianity, using it when convenient and attacking it when it resisted, the Nazi regime progressively moved toward suppressing authentic Christian faith that refused to bend to Nazi ideology. The Confessing Church, led by figures like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Niemöller, resisted Nazi attempts to control Christianity and suffered severe persecution as a result. Thousands of clergy were arrested, sent to concentration camps, or executed for refusing to compromise their faith with Nazi ideology. Bonhoeffer himself was executed in April 1945 for his involvement in resistance activities. Beyond Christianity, Hitler's war against the Jewish people represents perhaps the most systematic attempt to annihilate a religious and ethnic group in human history. 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, a figure so staggering that it challenges comprehension. This was not merely political persecution, but an attempt to erase an entire people from existence, a people who held a special place in biblical history as the original recipients of God's covenant. The prophecy speaks of conquering the saints, and while the Nazis temporarily appeared victorious, murdering millions and crushing resistance, the ultimate conquest prophesied in Revelation is temporary, followed by the beast's own destruction. The fifth description involves the beast's authority extending over many nations and peoples. Revelation 13, verse 7, continues by stating that authority was given over every tribe, people, language, and nation. At the height of Nazi power, Hitler controlled or influenced an enormous portion of Europe and beyond. Through direct conquest, military occupation, puppet governments, and alliances, the Nazi regime held sway from the Atlantic coast of France to the outskirts of Moscow, from Norway in the north to North Africa in the south. Millions of people of different languages, cultures, and ethnicities fell under Nazi control. The occupation of France brought French speakers under German rule. The invasion of the Soviet Union brought Russian speakers and numerous other ethnic groups. The Balkans added yet more diversity, and Nazi influence extended through allies like Italy, Hungary, Romania, and for a time even affected policy in nominally neutral countries. The systematic nature of Nazi control over these diverse populations was unprecedented. The regime imposed its racial laws, economic policies, and political structures across all conquered territories, attempting to reshape Europe according to Nazi ideology. The prophecy's description of authority over every tribe and tongue and nation, while possibly hyperbolic in its original context, finds a stark parallel in Hitler's ambitions and temporary success in dominating much of the European continent. His vision extended even further, seeking ultimate dominance in what the Nazis called the New Order, a restructuring of global power with Germany at its center. While Hitler never achieved global domination, his reach extended far enough to affect the lives of hundreds of millions of people across multiple continents. The sixth characteristic relates to the number associated with the beast. Revelation 13, verses 17 and 18, present one of the most famous passages in all of apocalyptic literature, stating that no one could buy or sell unless they had the mark, the name of the beast or the number of its name, and that this number is 666. This passage has generated countless interpretations, and applying it to Hitler requires examining various numerical connections. Some have pointed to gematria, the practice of assigning numerical values to letters, noting that Hitler's name in various languages and numerical systems can be manipulated to produce connections to this number. More substantively, some point to the Nazi system of identification and control, which, while not using a specific mark or number in exactly the way Revelation describes, did implement unprecedented systems of documentation, identification, and economic control. The Nazi regime required extensive documentation of racial heritage, issued identification papers that determined whether individuals could participate in economic life, and in occupied territories, often literally controlled, who could buy and sell through rationing systems, occupation currency, and regulations that excluded certain groups from economic activity. Jews were progressively banned from professions, their businesses confiscated, and eventually they were entirely excluded from economic life before being deported to death camps. While this does not match the prophecy exactly, the pattern of a totalitarian system controlling economic participation based on compliance with the regime's ideology parallels the concept described in Revelation. The specific number 666 has been connected to Hitler through various numerical schemes, though these tend to be more speculative and depend on which numerical system and which version of his name one uses. The seventh characteristic involves deception and performing great signs. Revelation 13 describes another beast, often called the false prophet, who performs great signs and deceives those who dwell on earth, telling them to make an image of the first beast. While Hitler himself did not perform miracles in the supernatural sense, the Nazi regime mastered propaganda and spectacle to a degree previously unknown in human history. Under Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda machine created what can only be described as a manufactured reality, using every available medium to shape public perception. The Nuremberg rallies, immortalized in Leni Riefenstahl's film Triumph of the Will, were carefully choreographed spectacles designed to overwhelm the senses and create an impression of overwhelming power and unity. The use of technology, lighting, sound, and mass participation created experiences that participants described in almost religious terms, as moments of transcendence and communion with something greater than themselves. This was deception through spectacle, through the manipulation of emotion and perception rather than through supernatural signs, yet the effect was similar. People were deceived into believing lies, into following a movement that led to catastrophe, into supporting policies that their rational moral sense should have rejected. The regime also promoted pseudoscientific racial theories as established fact, deceiving millions into believing that race determined human worth, and that certain groups were biologically inferior. This intellectual deception, combined with emotional manipulation through spectacle, created a comprehensive system of illusion that parallels the prophetic description of deception through signs and wonders. The image of the beast that people were told to worship finds a parallel in the ubiquitous images of Hitler that appeared everywhere in Nazi Germany, in homes, schools, offices, and public spaces, serving as a constant reminder of the regime's presence and demanding loyalty. The eighth description concerns the duration of the beast's power. Revelation 13, verse 5, states that the beast was given authority for 42 months, which equals 3.5 years. Hitler's reign of maximum destructive power, from the invasion of Poland in September 1939 to the turning point of the war, offers interesting chronological parallels, though exact application requires some interpretive flexibility. The period of Nazi Germany's greatest expansion and apparent invincibility lasted from the fall of France in June 1940 to the Battle of Stalingrad, which began in August 1942 and ended in February 1943. This represents roughly 2.5 to 3 years. However, if one counts from the beginning of unrestricted warfare in September 1939 to the decisive turning points of 1942 and 1943, the timeline approximates the prophetic period. Some interpreters point to different bookends for this period, perhaps from the peak of German power to the Allied landing at Normandy, or from one significant event to another, finding ways to arrive at the 3.5-year period. The challenge with this characteristic is that it requires selecting specific start and end dates from a continuous historical process, and different selections can support or undermine the connection. What remains undeniable is that Hitler's period of apparent invincibility was relatively brief in historical terms. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years collapsed in 12, and the period during which Nazi Germany seemed unstoppable and dominant was even shorter, measured in just a few years rather than decades. The ninth characteristic involves the beast's origin and nature as described in various passages. Revelation 11 describes a beast coming up from the abyss, and chapter 13 describes one rising from the sea, imagery that biblical scholars interpret as representing chaos, evil, and the realm of the dead or demonic. While this is clearly symbolic language, examining Hitler's psychological profile and the origins of his ideology reveals connections to themes of death, destruction, and what many have characterized as a demonic worldview. Hitler's ideology was fundamentally nihilistic at its core, despite its pretensions to creating a new order. It glorified violence, celebrated death in service to the state, and was built on a foundation of hatred and destruction rather than genuine creation. Hitler's own psychological makeup, as analyzed by contemporaries and historians, revealed a personality drawn to darkness, destruction, and death. His artwork from his early years often featured buildings and monuments, but rarely people. And when people did appear, they were usually small and insignificant against imposing structures. His political vision centered on conflict, viewing life as eternal struggle between races and nations, with peace being merely a temporary pause in necessary warfare. His orders in the final days of the war demonstrated a willingness to destroy Germany itself rather than surrender, commanding the destruction of infrastructure and resources in a nihilistic fury. This scorched earth policy toward his own nation reveals the essentially destructive nature of his ideology. It built nothing lasting but destroyed on a scale almost unprecedented. The imagery of rising from the abyss, from the realm of death and chaos, metaphorically describes someone whose entire worldview and program was rooted in destruction, death, and the negation of life's value except as it served the state's purposes. The 10th characteristic concerns the beast's ultimate fate and defeat. Revelation 19 describes the beast being captured and thrown into the lake of fire, destroyed by divine intervention rather than merely defeated by human armies. Hitler's end in his bunker beneath Berlin, committing suicide as Soviet armies closed in, followed by the complete destruction of Nazi Germany, offers both parallels and divergences from this prophetic description. Hitler's suicide on April 30, 1945, was an ignominious end for someone who had claimed to be Germany's savior and the master of Europe. His body was burned, reportedly on his own instructions, in a shell crater outside the bunker, a funeral pyre that consumed the man who had ordered the cremation of millions in his death camps. The destruction of Nazi Germany was total. The nation was divided, occupied, its leaders executed or imprisoned after the Nuremberg trials, its ideology discredited and banned, and its very name became synonymous with evil. In one sense, this represents the most complete defeat imaginable, the utter annihilation of everything Hitler built and stood for. However, the prophecy in Revelation suggests supernatural judgment, the beast being thrown into the lake of fire by divine action, which is clearly not what happened historically. Hitler took his own life, and human armies defeated Germany. Yet some interpreters suggest that the supernatural element might be understood as God working through historical events, using human agents to accomplish divine judgment. The complete and irreversible nature of Nazi Germany's defeat, the way Hitler's legacy became an enduring symbol of evil rather than the 1,000-year Reich he promised, could be understood as a form of ultimate judgment, even if the mechanism was historical rather than miraculous. Beyond these 10 characteristics, examining the broader context of Revelation's prophecies and their possible connection to World War II requires understanding the symbolic and apocalyptic nature of the text. Revelation was written during a period of persecution, probably during the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian, using coded language to speak about contemporary events while also pointing toward future fulfillment. The book employs a symbolic system drawn from Old Testament prophecy, particularly Daniel and Ezekiel, using images of beasts, numbers, and cosmic conflict to convey spiritual truths and warnings. This means the text operates on multiple levels simultaneously. It spoke to its original audience about their immediate situation. It contains timeless spiritual principles about the nature of evil and God's ultimate victory, and it may also contain predictions about future events. The question of whether Hitler and World War II represent the ultimate fulfillment of these prophecies, a partial fulfillment, or simply a historical parallel that resembles the prophetic pattern, depends largely on one's theological framework and interpretive approach. Christian tradition has long held that the Antichrist would appear during a final period of tribulation before Christ's return, and many theologians argue that since Christ has not yet returned, Hitler cannot have been the Antichrist, though he may have been a type or prefigurement of that final figure. This view holds that history contains multiple figures who embody Antichrist characteristics, with a final, ultimate Antichrist appearing at the end of history. Hitler, in this view, would be one of history's many Antichrist figures, bearing enough resemblance to the prophetic description to serve as a warning and example of what the final figure might be like. Others argue that prophecy can have multiple fulfillments, that the same prophetic vision might apply to several different historical situations, each fulfilling aspects of the prophecy in different ways. In this framework, Revelation's prophecies could have applied to the Roman Empire in the 1st century, to various persecuting powers throughout church history, to Hitler and Nazi Germany in the 20th century, and potentially to a final future fulfillment. Each fulfillment would match some, but not all aspects of the prophecy, with the ultimate fulfillment matching it completely. This layered approach to prophetic interpretation allows for seeing Hitler as a legitimate fulfillment of aspects of Revelation's prophecies, without claiming he was the final Antichrist figure. The historical parallels extend beyond just the 10 characteristics into the broader apocalyptic imagery of Revelation. The book describes war, famine, death, and destruction on a massive scale, cosmic conflict between good and evil, the persecution of believers, and the apparent triumph of evil before God's ultimate victory. World War II encompassed all of these elements. The war itself killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people, making it the deadliest conflict in human history. Entire cities were destroyed, from Warsaw to Dresden to Hiroshima. The Holocaust represented an attempt at genocide so systematic and thorough that it required the coining of a new term to describe it. Millions starved in occupied territories, in besieged cities like Leningrad, and in concentration camps. The horsemen of the apocalypse, conquest, war, famine, and death rode across Europe and Asia with unprecedented fury. The book of Revelation also describes the marking of people, the sealing of the faithful with God's mark on their foreheads, in contrast to those who received the mark of the beast. The Nazi regime marked people in various ways, most infamously tattooing numbers on concentration camp prisoners and forcing Jews to wear yellow stars. This physical marking system identified who was inside and who was outside the regime's favor, who could participate in society, and who was marked for destruction. While the biblical prophecy describes a more explicitly religious marking system, the parallel of a totalitarian regime marking people and controlling their lives based on these marks has not gone unnoticed by prophetic interpreters. Furthermore, Revelation describes economic control and manipulation, the ability to control who can buy and sell, and the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a corrupt system symbolized by Babylon. The Nazi regime exercised unprecedented control over economic life, seizing Jewish property and businesses, controlling production and distribution, implementing forced labor on a massive scale, and creating an economic system entirely subordinate to the state's militaristic goals. The plunder of occupied nations, the confiscation of wealth, and the reduction of millions to slave labor created an economic empire built on theft and exploitation, echoing the descriptions of Babylon's wealth built on the blood of the saints. The apocalyptic imagery of beasts and dragons in Revelation has also been connected to the symbols and mythology of the Nazi regime. The Nazi aesthetic celebrated power, aggression, and domination, using eagles, wolves, and other predatory animals as symbols. The SS, Hitler's elite guard responsible for the Holocaust, used twin lightning bolt runes as their symbol, evoking power and destructive force. The regime's propaganda consistently used imagery of strength, conquest, and dominance. While this differs from the specific beasts described in Revelation, the use of aggressive animal imagery and symbols of destructive power creates a thematic connection to the prophetic vision of bestial kingdoms that devour and destroy. Revelation also speaks of false prophets and deceivers who lead people astray through signs and wonders. The Nazi regime had numerous figures who could fit this role beyond Hitler himself. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, was a master of manipulation and deception, creating a false reality through media control. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, combined Nazi racial ideology with occult interests, creating a pseudo-mystical ideology for the SS. Alfred Rosenberg developed the philosophical and religious justifications for Nazi ideology, attempting to create a new mythology to replace Christianity. These figures, and others in the Nazi leadership, collectively functioned as a system of false teachers and prophets, leading millions astray through a combination of intellectual deception, emotional manipulation, and the promise of national greatness. The geographical scope of World War II also connects to prophetic imagery. Revelation describes conflict involving many nations, with armies gathered at Armageddon, a plain in Israel associated with historic battles. While World War II's major battles occurred far from this specific location, the war was truly global, fought in Europe, Asia, Africa, and across the oceans. The conflict drew in nations from every continent, from the United States and Canada in North America, to the Soviet Union spanning Europe and Asia, to Japan and China in East Asia, to British and Italian forces fighting in North Africa, to battles in the Pacific Islands, and resistance movements across occupied Europe. No previous war in human history had been so extensive or involved so many nations. This global scope echoes the prophetic vision of a final worldwide conflict. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 introduced weapons that seem to fulfill ancient descriptions of apocalyptic destruction. Revelation describes fire falling from heaven, massive destruction, and people seeking death but not finding it, suffering from grievous wounds. The immediate effects of the atomic bombs, the flash of light brighter than the sun, the fireball and mushroom cloud, the instant vaporization of thousands, the lingering radiation sickness that caused suffering for years afterward, all seem to match prophetic descriptions in ways conventional weapons never had. Survivors described a scene of apocalyptic horror, with the living envying the dead, with people so badly burned they were unrecognizable, with destruction so complete that entire city centers simply ceased to exist. While atomic weapons were developed and used by the Allies against Japan rather than by Hitler, they emerged from the context of World War II and demonstrated that humanity now possessed the capability to enact the kind of widespread destruction that apocalyptic prophecy described. The question of why God would allow such evil, why divine intervention did not prevent the Holocaust and the war, connects to theological themes in Revelation. The book presents a framework where evil is permitted to run its course for a time, where the beast is given authority for a season, but where ultimate justice and judgment are certain. This temporary permission of evil serves purposes in the divine plan, including the testing and refining of faith, the demonstration of evil's true nature, and the setting of the stage for God's ultimate victory. From this perspective, the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust, while not directly caused by God, were permitted within a framework where human free will and divine sovereignty coexist, where evil can manifest in history but cannot ultimately prevail. The Nazi regime's destruction, the survival of the Jewish people despite Hitler's attempt at genocide, and the eventual triumph of the Allies could be seen as demonstrating the principle that evil's apparent victories are temporary and that justice, though delayed, ultimately prevails. The role of resistance and faithfulness during the Nazi period also connects to Revelation's themes. The book repeatedly calls for patient endurance and faithfulness among believers, promising that those who remain faithful, even unto death, will be vindicated. During the Nazi era, countless individuals chose resistance over collaboration, faithfulness over compromise, even when it cost them their lives. The martyrs of the Christian resistance like Bonhoeffer, the righteous Gentiles who hid Jews at great personal risk, the resistance fighters across occupied Europe, and those who maintained moral clarity in the face of totalitarian pressure, exemplified the kind of steadfast faithfulness Revelation calls for. Their stories demonstrate that even in the darkest times, when evil seems overwhelming and resistance appears futile, faithfulness is possible and ultimately meaningful. The impact of World War II on Christian eschatology and prophetic interpretation was profound. The sheer scale of the destruction, the revelation of the Holocaust's horrors, and the development of nuclear weapons convinced many Christians that the end times were approaching. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, shortly after the war, seemed to many to fulfill biblical prophecies about the Jewish people returning to their land, adding another layer to eschatological speculation. This post-war period saw an explosion of prophetic teaching and interpretation, much of it looking back at World War II as a key event in the unfolding of end-times prophecy. While earlier generations of Christians had interpreted contemporary events through the lens of biblical prophecy, the scale and nature of World War II seemed to match prophetic descriptions more closely than previous conflicts had. The dehumanization central to Nazi ideology also connects to apocalyptic themes. Revelation describes the beast system as fundamentally opposed to human dignity and worth, destroying people and treating them as expendable. Nazi racial ideology denied the full humanity of Jews, Slavs, Roma, and others deemed inferior, treating them as subhuman and therefore subject to exploitation and extermination. This denial of human dignity, this categorization of people as more or less human based on arbitrary characteristics, represents a fundamental rejection of the biblical view that all humans are created in God's image. The concentration camps, the death camps, the medical experiments, the casual brutality, all stemmed from this dehumanizing ideology. The prophetic vision warns of a system that denies human worth and dignity, that treats people as means to an end, that destroys without conscience, and Nazi Germany embodied this warning with terrible clarity. The speed and totality of Germany's collapse in 1945 also carries echoes of prophetic descriptions of sudden judgment. Revelation describes the fall of Babylon as happening in a single hour, a sudden and complete collapse of what seemed to be an invincible system. In January 1945, Nazi Germany still controlled significant territory and possessed millions of men under arms. By May, the Reich had completely collapsed. Hitler was dead, the Nazi leadership was captured or in flight, and Germany was occupied and divided. This rapid disintegration of what had seemed to be an enduring empire, built to last 1,000 years, but collapsing in its 12th year, mirrors the prophetic pattern of sudden judgment and collapse. The completeness of the collapse was also significant. There was no residual Nazi state, no government in exile that maintained legitimacy, no negotiated settlement that allowed Nazi ideology to survive in modified form. The defeat was total, and the ideology was universally discredited, at least officially. The question of Hitler's own spiritual state and relationship to evil forces is relevant to the Antichrist connection, though necessarily speculative. Those who knew Hitler described a personality that seemed possessed by ideas rather than being their master, someone who appeared to be driven by forces beyond normal human ambition. His ability to mesmerize audiences, his apparent lack of normal human compassion or empathy, his dedication to destruction even of his own people when they failed to achieve his vision, all suggested a personality that had moved beyond normal human evil into something more profound. Whether this represents literal demonic possession, as some Christian interpreters have suggested, or simply the natural development of an evil ideology taken to its logical conclusion, is a matter of theological interpretation. What remains clear is that Hitler embodied evil in a particularly pure and destructive form, showing little of the mixture of good and evil that characterizes most human personalities. The Nazi use of Christian symbols and language in a perverted form also connects to warnings about false teaching and deception. The regime used Christian language and imagery when convenient, but systematically undermined Christian teaching and morality. Hitler claimed to be doing God's work. The Nazis used the language of providence and destiny. Party rituals borrowed elements from Christian liturgy, yet the substance of Nazi ideology contradicted Christian teaching at almost every point. This use of religious language and symbolism to mask an fundamentally anti-religious ideology fits the pattern of the false prophet in Revelation, who appears religious but actually serves the beast and leads people away from true faith. Looking at the 7-year period that some prophetic interpretations identify as the final tribulation, the period from September 1938 to September 1945, from the Munich Agreement that allowed Hitler to annex parts of Czechoslovakia through to Japan's final surrender, encompasses roughly 7 years. During the middle of this period, Hitler's power was at its peak, and the destruction was at its worst, corresponding to prophetic descriptions of great tribulation in the middle of the final 7 years. While this requires selecting specific dates and may be somewhat arbitrary, the pattern is notable enough to have attracted attention from those seeking prophetic fulfillments. The second half of this period saw increasing destruction and suffering, culminating in the atomic bombs and the complete defeat of the Axis powers, matching the prophetic pattern of increasing intensity of judgment and tribulation. The Holocaust itself represents a level of systematic evil that seems to transcend normal human cruelty. The bureaucratic organization of genocide, the systematic dehumanization, the industrial scale of killing, all combine to create something that seemed to be evil operating in a pure form. The fact that this occurred in Germany, one of the most educated and culturally advanced nations in Europe, demonstrated that civilization provided no reliable protection against the depths of evil that humans could reach. This revelation of the potential for absolute evil within human civilization shook assumptions about human progress and the inevitable march toward enlightenment. It forced a recognition that evil of the sort described in apocalyptic prophecy was not merely ancient superstition, but a real possibility in the modern world. The role of technology in enabling Nazi evil also connects to apocalyptic themes. Revelation describes the beast system as having great power and capability, able to implement its will across many nations and control populations. The Nazi regime used modern technology, railroads for deportations, gas chambers for industrialized killing, IBM punch card systems for identifying and tracking victims, radio for propaganda, and modern bureaucracy for organizing genocide. This marriage of technological capability with absolute evil created something unprecedented. Previous genocides and massacres had been limited by technological constraints. The Nazis had no such limits, and the result was destruction on an unimaginable scale. This demonstrated that technological progress, far from guaranteeing moral progress, could enable evil to operate more efficiently than ever before. In examining these connections between Hitler, Nazi Germany, World War II, and the prophecies in Revelation, several conclusions emerge. First, the parallels are striking enough that dismissing them entirely seems unwarranted. Hitler and his regime did exhibit many of the characteristics attributed to the Antichrist figure in biblical prophecy, from the nature of his rise to power, to his blasphemous claims, to his persecution of believers, to his temporary triumph followed by complete destruction. Second, the parallels are imperfect, as none of the characteristics match exactly in every detail. This could mean Hitler was not the ultimate Antichrist, but a precursor or type. Or it could mean that prophetic language is necessarily symbolic and approximate rather than literally precise. Third, the impact of World War II on human consciousness and history was profound enough that whether or not it represents the fulfillment of specific prophecies, it serves as a powerful demonstration of the principles those prophecies warn about: the danger of totalitarianism, the reality of human evil, the importance of resistance to tyranny, and the ultimate failure of empires built on violence and hatred. The lasting lesson from examining these connections is not primarily about validating a particular prophetic interpretation, though that remains important to many believers. Rather, it is about recognizing patterns of evil and being prepared to resist them. If Hitler and Nazi Germany embodied Antichrist characteristics, then understanding those characteristics helps identify similar dangers in other times and places. The warning inherent in apocalyptic prophecy is not just about a single final figure, but about recognizing and resisting evil in whatever form it takes, whether ancient Rome, medieval persecutors, 20th century totalitarians, or future threats yet unknown. The Book of Revelation, whether or not it specifically predicted World War II in a literal sense, provides a framework for understanding evil's nature, its temporary success, and its ultimate defeat, a framework that proved painfully relevant during the Nazi era and remains relevant today.